And just remains for me to thank Alan ever so much for taking the time to come and present to us this evening on a topic which, of course, is central to the Crime, Security and Justice Network's interests, and that is rethinking criminal justice, that kind of element of thinking about justice in relationship to crime and security. Alan has a new book out with that title, and the subtitle of Punishments, Abolition, Moral Psychology, and interesting thesis then, an intervention from a critical realist point of view in the much broader macro arguments about criminal justice and abolitionism, penal abolitionism, because there's a long history. Alan is professor, as many of you will know, at School of Law at the University of Warwick, and a fellow of the British Academy. And I understand a lot of the work that's in the book, although Alan will talk about this in more detail presently, is based upon Liverpool Fellowship he had. We have until 7:30. So plenty of time, or we not necessarily need all of that time, depending on how we are. But Alan, did you have a sense of how long you wanted to talk, or how you wanted to structure it, a conversational presentation, then questions after? We're entirely in your hands.
Oh, well, well, first of all, thanks so much, Adam, for inviting me. And I agree about it's a good opportunity to sort of get together again after last summer. What I plan to do is I've circulated through Mark just a 5-page script, which is actually taken from the start of my book. And what I plan to do is actually to read through that. And I don't know how long it'll take me. I would have thought 30 minutes would be about right. I don't want to go on too long. And I would be I'd apologise for sort of reading from a script, especially as you've got it. But it's quite a tightly argued beginning to the book, so I don't want to, as it were, to lose the sort of the fundamental argument by ad-libbing too much. Especially as this will be the first time that I've it's like a kind of pre-launch event, this, because the book doesn't come out until the summer.
Ah, okay.
So this is a pre-launch launch, as it were.
Excellent. So hot off the press, it isn't off the press yet.
It's so hot, it's not even off the press. Yeah.
Well, we're even more privileged, Alan, and thank you for that. So, I mean, would you want? Are you intending on using any visual aids, or just a verbal presentation of the?
Yeah, I'll just give the presentation.
Perfect, great.
And yeah, because everyone should have it. So
yeah, we circulated that before, Alan. Absolutely, yeah. I had the pleasure of reading through it again this afternoon, so I know it's a very interesting, evocative argument. Okay, then. Well, look, it's 2:45. I know Mark will be keeping an eye on any of the further comers, but shall we commence?
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Adam and Mark. And I had to postpone earlier in the year because of a nagging tooth problem. So sorry about that, and I'm just glad to have been able to get to you eventually. And just to say also, congratulations on the work you're doing. It was very good to meet last summer at IACRE at Warwick, and now to be able to sort of share our ideas. As I said, this is really a pre-launch event for my book, which has the title Rethinking Criminal Justice, Punishment, Abolition and Moral Psychology, and it'll be published in the late summer by CUP in their Law and Context series. The book has been literally and figuratively a labour of love, especially in that it has taken 10 years to complete, but also in that the core idea in it is an analysis that's based upon love, understood in both metaphysical and meta-psychological or psychoanalytic terms. It's a book that draws on critical realism's account of human ontology, and I think it makes its own special contribution to this in its development of a psychoanalytic account of love to set beside Roy Basker's metaphysical count in his philosophy of meta-reality. I see this as an extension of original critical realist themes around the nature of human being, which I take up with the idea of the animal that thinks and loves. That's the book's motto, for the animal that thinks and loves, or more briefly, the metaphysical animal. It's be fairly clear that this is not an exercise in applied critical realism. Very important though exercises of that kind are, and maybe we can explore at the end how these things fit together. But my own feeling is that, you know, and I've always felt that critical realism has got this kind of capacity to move, not exactly seamlessly, but it certainly has the space, the intellectual space to move from the between different elements and to be relevant in practice, to be applied in just the same way, and also just because it is theoretically deep and developing still. Something to think about later, maybe. But anyway, from the idea of the metaphysical animal, or the animal that thinks and loves, I argue that it is in human ontology to seek to reconcile with self and others after trauma around violation. And this gives a different basis for thinking about how it would help victims and perpetrators and society as a whole to deal with crime and punishment. This takes me to the critique of what I call the penal equation and what my colleague Amanda Wilson calls the penal bind, as she puts it. So just a very kind of a rudimentary introduction before I get into my text. This comes from the blurb of the book, the back cover of the book, and it's 150 words to summarize rather a lot more words, but I think it maybe gives you an idea of the overall thing. So it starts by saying, for 200 years, the penal equation, crime plus blame equals punishment, has meant prison crises, a permanent crime problem, violent and damaged lives. The retributive theory of punishment supports this. Fully developed, it could transform it. A moral psychology of violation distinguishes primitive and mature retributivism, explaining punishment's necessary failure and guilt, forgiveness, and reconciliation's power. Atonement means both punitive payback and being at one again with self and others. That is, in the sense of being literally at one-ment. Reconciliation for offender, victim, and society leads to punishment's deep, tendential abolition. The blurb goes on that this account of mature retributivism is rooted in human ontology, in the metaphysical animal that thinks and loves, and it speaks to law, philosophy, criminology, and criminal justice in a moral psychology which considers victims who victimize others, grief at violation, denial and mourning, and what I call the loving prison. Exploring ethics, psychoanalysis, social theory, testimony, and film, this psychologically developed moral philosophy challenges basic assumptions about punishment and the penal equation. Now, so shifting to the actual preface, which comes, it's a slightly earlier draft from what's actually in the book, but there's not much difference. I start by saying that my original title was Criminal Justice and the Blaming Relation, but I found the idea of a blaming relation needed deeper investigation than I had realized, hence the 10 years in writing the thing. As the final title suggests, I was led into questions about moral psychology, which make a blaming relation possible. Eventually, I came to the book's underlying idea and its substantive conclusion. The main idea is that criminal justice should be designed to reflect our nature as human beings, as the animal that thinks and loves. Though it covers a lot of ground, its main conclusion, second point, is that the retributive philosophy, usually understood as criminal punishment's main justification, in fact, eventually, when pushed to its limit, requires its abolition. Now, this is, and I want to make the claim, this is a philosophical argument. The argument is that existing penal theory leads to an abolitionist conclusion, even if it might seem in its very essence to reject it. That's why it's called penal theory. Penal abolition is not hugely popular in criminal justice circles, despite the system's obvious failures. This may be the result of an inability to think beyond the current ways of doing things. It could also be the result of a kind of turf war in which political theorists hold on to the ideas of punishment to defend their theory against critics. Retributive theorists, philosophers, political theorists, I think, feel quite vulnerable to criminological ways of looking at things, but they have their own turf. And so they hold on to that as best they can. It may also be that there are good reasons for rejecting existing abolitionist approaches as undercooked or impractical. I actually share some of those views. But whatever, and I'll come on to that at the end of this presentation, whatever the reason, this book's aim is to show the heretofore hidden connection between law's retributive theory and an abolitionist penal practice normally seen as negating it. How is it possible to do both, to reject criminal punishment and see that a fully developed retributivism is abolitionist in its implications? The answer lies in what I call a deep or tendential abolitionism, which lies within, when you dig into the theory of punishment, lies within it. Through moral psychology, we find an immanent, to be distinguished from imminent, we find an immanent abolitionist direction of travel that emerges from the mature retributive theory developed here. Importantly, this argument is not a takeover of the philosophy of punishment by another discipline, that is, psychology or moral psychology. It's a philosophical argument, I argue, in its own right, once philosophy is understood, as I believe it should be, in the fuller Greek or Socratic manner that I argue for. Okay, so I think that's a big difference, this work is grounded in, eventually goes back to Greek philosophy. It's not based upon the kind of modern Enlightenment approaches that I think lie behind most analytical philosophy. The book starts with questions of method. At the beginning, I outline different kinds of critique, and two of these are immanent and ontological, and a third and fourth stem from these. Firstly, with regard to immanent critique, through the problems and impasses of existing criminal justice theory, the book moves forward. But then it develops second, an ontological critique in the form of a substantive moral psychology of guilt, responsibility, forgiveness, reconciliation, and other terms which reflect how human beings operate when faced with violation. The essence of human being is that we are metaphysical animals, capable of thought and love. And this is at the root of our moral psychology. I mean, in essence, what I'm trying to do is say, stop thinking about punishment as your starting point and start thinking about the nature of what we are as human animals. This psychology is third, the basis for a critique contrasting the way human beings are with how they are understood in criminal justice theory. It generates what I call an ethically real and institutionally critical position. So a realist ethics and held up against a critique and giving rise to a critique of what we do institutionally. And I call this ethically real and institutionally critical position an ERIC critique for short. This is a realist-based critique of existing practice, which then generates a fourth critique in the form of a way of thinking about violation that is emancipatory in its implications. Gives rise to, as Jimmy Boyle puts it, and this comes up at the end of the book, a sense of freedom. The argument is commenced in parts 1 and 2, probing our existing knowledge immanently and ontologically. Skip that. The abolitionist conclusion emerges as the work proceeds. It comes both immanently from penal theory's existing premises and ontologically from the moral psychology developed alongside these. I should say I didn't start out with the conclusions, but as it were, I hope this is a positive thing, but I discovered them in thinking through what it was I was trying to do. So chapter 1 starts with dissatisfaction with existing inquiry and indicates possible ways of moving forward. And it also provides a brief sketch of my own pre-project starting point where I had begun to think about the importance of love. It then moves in chapter 2, and this got me going. It was an introductory prototype argument which compared the young and the older Hegel. I mean, I've looked at the older Hegel over many, many years and critiqued him, but I felt coming to this work that the young Hegel was in a way more important, because it's in the young Hegel that we see a critique of existing law based upon love. You'll see later that I talk about a mature understanding of human psychology, and it seemed to me sort of paradoxically that the older Hegel got, the less mature his work gets, because it's more based upon existing ideas of crime and punishment. So I then pick up in chapter 3 the perennial criminal justice problem of just deserts in an unjust society. That goes right back to the 1970s, Andrew von Hirsch. But I refer to it here as thinking about the guilt of victims who victimize others, because I want to make clear that people who commit crimes often are victims in themselves, but there's a double relationship. They are victims, but they also do victimize others. And I think that that's an important point that political theory finds quite hard to deal with, whereas I think moral psychology does a lot better. So what about moral psychology and love? Well, the argument progressed. First of all, the young Hegel had written of love as the core of human ethical life, and this seemed important, but also perhaps counterintuitive. It felt like quite a kind of original step to say, well, I'm going to actually investigate criminal justice starting with love. Chapter 2 contrasts, as I said, the young Hegel's account of love, grief, and injury with his later work on law as right. So that's the starting point. Chapter 3 then starts a deeper foray into love and moral psychology through psychoanalytical thought. It contrasts guilt in liberal political theory with an understanding of what is at work when people feel moral guilt for harming others. It begins to explore love and moral psychology through 2 works, Jessica Benjamin's The Bonds of Love and Jonathan Lear's Love and Its Place in Nature. These help us understand love as a ground of human being, and I see them as establishing the deeper foundations for ideas and feelings of guilt, forgiveness, and blame. Benjamin's work in this chapter 3 is really important because she talks about love in a psychoanalytic vein and its importance to recognition, and that becomes later on in my work the importance of reconciliation. So this is a first step into moral psychology, in particular the work of Freud. And here Lear's work later on, connecting with the psychoanalyst Hans Löwald, will take me further forward. 2 further chapters in this section. One is Martha Nussbaum's, an engagement with Martha Nussbaum's anger and forgiveness. And so it's a chapter on forgiveness. And I did really want to major in forgiveness and not just talk about guilt. But I actually thought I was going to really take a lot from Nussbaum. And in fact, I have taken a lot from Nussbaum. but it was more her earlier work, because when she came to write her Anger and Forgiveness, she stepped back from the psychoanalytical commitments in favor of a recourse to unconditional love by itself, philosophical love. And I was forced to really kind of think, well, why is psychoanalysis, metapsychology important to me? The second encounter was I think this really kind of was extremely important for me. And I didn't really think it was, I thought it was kind of, what would I say, a bit of kind of background reading, if you like. I remember I took it on a long plane journey. Marina Cantacuzino's The Forgiveness Project. This is a collection of quite brief personal accounts of forgiveness and guilt. And I read this alongside Marion Partington's If You Sit Very Still, which was her memoir of her sister Lucy's murder by Fred and Rose West. And what I found was that these kind of statements of what people felt and the relationship between love, forgiveness, and guilt as, first person accounts of what was really important to people who had experienced violation. It just kind of hit home to me that this was really not only just very moving, but sort of central to what it was that I wanted to do. Because writing about the blaming relation, I wanted to reflect on the position of both perpetrators and victims of violent crimes. These works in their emotional immediacy took me into questions of forgiveness and the position of the victim. They convinced me that there was an ethical experience of forgiveness based in love that needed to be brought into the discussion, and of course, importantly, not really dealt with in criminal justice matters, because the victim is not really dealt with in criminal justice matters. And this was the basis for the idea of a blaming relation, eventually that it would incorporate victims and perpetrators. And it was based around the notion of reconciliation, stemming from the love of family members grieving their loss. So love was at the root of these 4 chapters, and each one I was working through what it was that I wanted to say. And there was then a kind of step up in the book into the next section, which is the one that's on, really sort of builds up the notion of the metaphysical animal that thinks and loves. And what I wanted to do was to think about really what that really meant, what the animal that thinks and loves means, what the metaphysical animal is, because I wanted to see it as being not just, we can talk about the metaphysical animal, and what we mean is, well, set aside the animal part, and we just know that human beings are metaphysical. We think metaphysically. They're capable of metaphysical being and thinking, and we're just paradoxically an animal, but we can put the animal aside. But I wanted to say that the metaphysical animal really is an animal. We are physiologically and we are embodied beings, minded and embodied beings. So how do I get at that? Well, my starting point is I took this from an Oxford philosopher called Donald Mackinnon, who was very instrumental in discussions with people like Elizabeth Anscombe and Iris Murdoch in Oxford in the immediate post-Second World War period. And he used the idea of the metaphysical animal, but he used it really just to talk about that we were metaphysical beings. And I wanted to say it's 2 things. So one is the metaphysical in a narrower sense, meaning the capacity for ethical reflection on moral issues such as right and wrong, and all the terms that go along with that, including guilt and forgiveness. So that's standard. It's essentially a philosophical meaning, emphasizing the side of us that thinks, and in thinking expresses ourselves ethically. The second meaning is more about feeling. It comes from the animal side of our nature, meaning the human as a kind of mammal with natural powers and tendencies, and that is both feeling and intelligent. This is the human animal, the human animal as an embodied and somatic being, capable by virtue of its specific genetic inheritance of thought and love. And the challenge is to connect these two sides, mind and body. In the phrase metaphysical animal, both aspects must play their part. And the argument is that our minds are embodied, just as our bodies are minded, so that we're both metaphysical in a narrow sense and animal at the same time, and that is the metaphysical animal. Human being then involves both the possibility of metaphysical experience and reflection, and that this is grounded in our human psychological nature. The underlying need is to understand how these two come together, how, as Jonathan Lear puts it, the flesh can become word. Bringing them together is the way we understand our moral psychology as feeling, thinking, loving creatures, capable of ethical action, and of course of failing in such action. This then becomes, in relation to violation, the basis for thinking about how we might best deal with situations where humans violate each other. It provides a way of understanding our emotional and ethical reactions to violation and how we might process these. And this is the important point. It enables us to understand why we might value seeing another being punished as being somehow something that has value in it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it really has value in it, because it might become quite counterproductive. We might get caught up in a kind of cycle of punishment and aggression. And if we look more closely at what kind of animals human beings are, we might see that there are other emotional processes, deeper emotional processes, which help us move forward, which hide below the anger that we start with, but which are more important to us in terms of us resolving and living better with violation and trauma that are done to us. So this leads us to distinguish our more primitive from our more mature emotional reactions, and how these become translated into ethical sentiments, and I would say into a primitive versus a mature retributivism. Moral psychology as the reality of the metaphysical animal, the one that thinks and loves, provides a perspective on criminal punishment and why abolition represents a real and generally better way to deal with what happened. Why abolition, or reconciliation more broadly, represent a better way. The moral psychology of violation then. Okay, I'm doing all right for time, I think. Maybe another 6 or 7 minutes. I'll try and speed up a bit. The moral psychology of violation. So if the first two parts of the book work towards a moral psychology of violation, then these chapters about the metaphysical animal consolidate it by showing three things. First, they show that this moral psychology of the metaphysical animal does not impose an external critique on legal theory, political philosophy, or the philosophy of punishment. It ought not to be marginalized as saying, we do philosophy of punishment, you're doing something different. Rather, understood in Socratic philosophical terms, this approach represents a key and enriching contribution to what philosophy is or should be. Second, substantively, these chapters show that psychoanalysis, in the work of Freud, and I also bring in Melanie Klein here, distinguishes primitive or punitive and mature or restorative or reconciliative ways of dealing with violation and blame. These are relevant to thinking about better and worse ways of dealing with situations where one person violates another. Freud's account of guilt is critically analysed in these terms in chapter 7, and here the work of Lear and Lewald is key, while Klein's account is also brought in chapter 8. And so I think it's quite a well-developed account of how we get from psychoanalysis through love, through a particular kind of psychoanalytic thinking, to important issues for us as criminal justice theorists. Third, these chapters show we can identify law's retributive philosophy of punishment with a primitive and persecutory moral psychology. but we can also use it to develop a mature retributivism, one that is restorative and reconciliative in its approach. I draw here, among other ideas, on that of atonement, which can be understood either in primitive and punitive terms as paying back, or maturely as a form of being at one, reconciled with oneself and others after violation. This is atonement as at one-ment. In this way, the metapsychological grounds underlying our different kinds of ethical experience provide the ontological basis and then feed into mature retributivism. I mean, I hope that the critical realism in this is fairly clear from the emphasis on human ontology and how that establishes the basis for an ethically real critique of actually existing practices. Right, then the last three chapters, I'm moving on to the end now. I'll say a little bit about them. These are all applications of the main thesis, but they take me on to talking a bit about deep or tendential abolition in a final chapter. So the next two chapters are actually chapters based on reading films. So one film is a film called The Act of Killing, which is about the genocide in Indonesia in the 1960s. And it's a film about denial and how denial is overcome, even amongst those who are really have every reason to be in denial, because they live in a society that still comes to acclaim them, still acclaims them. So the first chapter 9 is about denial or disavowal. It looks at Stanley Cohen's work in States of Denial, and then says there is something really important here in the psychoanalytic approach that needs to be brought out. And then chapter 10, the film there is a film called Nostalgia for the Light, which is about women searching the desert for remains of their family members in Chile, family members who were murdered by the Pinochet regime. And that chapter, so one chapter is about perpetrators, the next chapter is about victims, and it considers what Freud meant when talking about mourning and melancholia and their importance for thinking about our metaphysics, how our metaphysical understanding of how we come to terms with violation. So that's those two chapters, and then chapter 11 is really an important chapter, and it takes me back to my starting point really in thinking about criminal justice matters, because at the time that I was just starting out as a young as an undergraduate student actually, and then as a postgraduate and an academic, a really influential book was Jimmy Boyle's, especially in Scotland, but beyond Scotland as well, was Jimmy Boyle's A Sense of Freedom, which was recently, or 2016, was re-released. And it was about his time in Barlinnie Special Unit in Glasgow in the 1970s. What that chapter does is it takes Boyle's book and it identifies a whole progression of ideas of freedom and reconciliation as he describes them in his account of his time in Barlinnie. And so you can see how he moves from a negative freedom that is based upon hatred for the prison and prison warders and the world, basically. And that's a negative freedom, but he increasingly in the special unit develops a more positive sense of himself and his place in the world and his place with others and his place in a community, and how a community that is based upon freedom can flourish even in the setting, even in a prison setting. So I see the special unit as a mature alternative to punishment that can exist even in the dark heart of the penal system. The special unit represented mature retributivism in action, and it provides the example in practice of an abolitionist approach to punishment in what I call, and I I admit to a small measure of provocation, the loving prison. It is noted, however, that the possibilities of developing a mature approach to violation depend on broader structural commitments. There needs to be both social and individual change, and it's not, this is not a recipe for reworking the prison system, although the prison system can do things in the way that the BSU did things, but it's about saying that we need to change the society and the penal structure as a whole, penal system as a whole, which I describe as persecutory in the major key and reparative in the minor key. So BSU is an example of an institution that is reparative in the minor key, but it had to fight throughout its life to be allowed to exist within the broader penal system. Right. So then the final chapter takes up the book's argument as a whole. A developed moral psychology of the human metaphysical animal, the animal that thinks and loves, provides us with an ontology of and for being human. That ontology distinguishes primitive, persecutory, and punitive responses from mature, restorative, and reconciliatory ones for dealing with violation. The resulting mature retributive theory makes abolition of punishment a real human possibility. It's ingredient in us as human beings that we could do that. Various implications of thinking about a mature retributive response to violation are explored, and some issues with abolitionist argument are addressed, but it's not a complete argument, I don't think, by any means, but it's putting something down as the basis for thinking through. This is a deeper tendential abolitionism which grounds abolition in human...
really quick.
Which grounds abolition in human ontology as its immanent power, whether exercised or not. While the argument is theoretical rather than practical, it offers an ethically real basis for asserting a counterposition, an Eric critique of the present system of criminal punishment. It refuses to be cowed by objections based upon what Kant called adverse experience. Kant is actually an amazing writer when he allowed himself to be in terms of his position on penal reform. Against skeptics, there is an ontological basis for holding to a real utopian position. That is, one that is ontologically grounded, even if it appears utopian under present social conditions. Against existing abolitionist positions, its deep and tendential form provides grounds for distinguishing between an immanent, latent and real, and an imminent, immediate demand for penal reform. I mean, when you hear the slogan "Abolition Now," which comes out of the United States, you can think, well, on the one hand, yes, I can see that. If what I'm saying is that human beings are capable of working towards reconciliation, then this is immanent within them. And so abolition now is a correct slogan. But there's another sense in which abolition now is not a correct slogan, which is to say, well, what would happen if we simply shut down all the prisons tomorrow, immediately, imminently? So it's an immanent demand, yes, but we have to think practically about how it works in practice. So I think that the last paragraph is really just summarizing what I've said. I think that the last, in the end, we have an immanent and ontological critique based on the moral psychology of the animal that thinks and loves. The last sentence in the book is that is something like this. This book is quite literally a work of love. A work of love, and it is, because it's saying that that's what that's like core human beings. There is the possibility of love We understand this in our human being, in our embodied being, starting with our relationships with our children and going beyond that into our relationship with others. So, it's there within us, and it's what, and Freud talked about, is also the thing of which the poets sing, and that's true as well. So it's got a metaphysical dimension to it as well. But the key contribution of the book is to say that we need to put those two things together, and then we have an ontological basis for arguing for reconciliation, rather than it just being a matter of, well, that's my choice. No, it's about what's in us as human beings, regardless of, and even though, and especially because the world is in many ways, and the penal world is in so many ways, so difficult to embrace. That's it.
Super, thank you, Alan. Can't wait to see the book when it's off the press. And the opportunity to read through that, perhaps while colleagues are gathering their thoughts and the questions they might want to put to you, in advance of the opportunity of reading the full thing itself when it comes out later in the year. I had a question. When I read through the preface you circulated beforehand, Alan,
yeah,
what immediately came to mind, and I'm sure be in the minds of others from a criminological as well as a sort of social, legal and philosophical backgrounds, is the work of the Australian criminologist John Braithwaite, because they seem to have such strong connotations here. I mean, both at the ontological level, as well as this sort of substantive focus upon reparative, restorative, or as he put it in his foundational text, then reintegrative shaming. And I just wondered to what extent that you engaged at all with Braithwaite's ideas, and how you would regard your thesis as doing something different, or augmenting or developing Braithwaite's work. Also, because I like the acronym ERIC. Ethically real, institutionally critical approach, because it brings together, it does really, I think it's pretty realist in the sense that it is emphasizing the concrete subsequently. What is the purpose of this is not just abstraction, important as that is, okay? It is with a purpose, to alter behavior, with reference to Barlini, victims of Fred West and so on and so forth, and what the practical adequacy, as critical realists would put it, of our theories. And here, of course, Braithwaite has set out an entire program over the last 40 years or so in terms of the institutional framework, very much trying to circumvent the criminal justice system and replace it with family conferences, reparative fora, and so on and so forth. And so I just wondered whether that provides you, or if you like, with a ready-made, if you like, institutional framework for your mature retributionism, or whether you're really doing something very different from that, without the privilege of having read the full book. It's just an obvious parallel. It struck me.
Yeah. Yes, thanks, Adam. That's a really good point to start with, I think, because there's I do mention Braithwaite in the book, and there's obviously comparisons with what he's doing in relation to, there's obviously comparisons with restorative justice in general with what I'm doing. But in part, just because I think that's another book, i.e. a book on restorative justice, a critique, because I think there needs to be a critique of, at the same time as there is something going on that you can see there's a family resemblance going on here. At the same time as that is true, I think work needs to be done of a critical kind on restorative justice as a theoretical approach. So, for example, one of the things that I think restorative justice does, and it's in Braithwaite's work, which is really important work, But what it does is it starts with that idea of reintegrative shaming. And I think that shaming is a problem, um, and needs to be developed, and it needs to be developed alongside understandings of guilt and forgiveness and reconciliation. Guilt, forgiveness, and reconciliation are the things that I talk a lot about. Shaming can be, the chain gang, people in orange jumpsuits, um, doing the working in the gardens of the town, or it can be you can have a mature kind of shame as well. But those kinds of distinctions and the relationship between guilt and shame are not brought out in the restorative justice literature as I know it, and they're not brought out in Braithwaite's work. And I think there's a reason for that, and I think the reason is that restorative justice theoretically sort of sits too close in a way to law. And so what it does is to say, well, look, how can we help law? How can we add to what law does? So on the one hand, you have law producing punishment. And how does law produce punishments? Through blame and through findings of guilt. Okay, so that means that if we're going to be different, but somehow adjoined to law, then we need to think we can't talk about guilt. So there's very little discussion of guilt in restorative justice literature. And that's why I think shame is seen as being important there. So I think that there needs to be a bit of work done on how restorative justice relates to the kind of moral psychology that I'm doing here. At the same time, I totally accept that what I'm doing here could be taken into and should be looked at in relation to family conferences. Having said that, I'm very much aware of the way in which institutional processes of doing restorative justice take on board something of the institutional framing, quite a lot of the institutional framing. So in a way, I think you could have an Eric critique of the way that family conferences work. Finally, I work closely with a colleague, Amanda Wilson, who's I see is with us tonight, and I would recommend her work on restorative justice and the book that she's writing on that, which is also forthcoming. It's like a bit further down. It's got a bit further to go than my book, but I think that she takes up a lot of these issues about how we need, if we're going to be ethically serious, then we need to dig deeper into the theory of reconciliation that underlies violation and how that would affect our understanding of restorative justice.
Super, thanks. And Amanda, we look forward to perhaps a presentation from yourself in the future and a look at the book as well. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, but without putting you on the spot.
Alan, could I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
And thank you for coming tonight, Alan. Really appreciate it. But it resonated with myself around about restorative justice, and I appreciate that there's, you're not really digging into it. But previous to academia, I was a police officer for 19 years, so I was very used to issuing out cautions and charges and not getting very far or not really sort of helping people in that way. And then I kind of got trained in restorative justice, and I delivered many a conference. And to cut a very long story short, around hate crimes and people shaking hands and having remarkable effects, and it really changed the way I saw justice, really, and one of the reasons why I've come into criminology. I think the key mechanism from a practical adequacy and knowledge of delivering those conferences, it kind of think it hooks into like criminologists like Christie, Niles Christie and Bauman, who talks about social distance, and even those the people who shook hands and said thank you very much. And I remember I had one poor student who was racially abused, and after a very convoluted prep for a conference which took months, they all went down the student union bar. You know, that was a remarkable result. I wouldn't say they necessarily would love one another or that their love was increased, but I think it was the social distance and the understanding. And I think that comes from, and I think you've tapped into it, we have this emotional response of love and hate. But also, I mean, and highlighted specifically like by Bauman, of that of the damage and harms of instrumental rationality when we're not emotionally thinking. You know, I mean, he gives a classic example. You know, it's going to looking at genocide, isn't he, and looking how instrumentally, you know, people, you know, that whole press was incremental and people didn't take ownership for that. So I wondered if you kind of tapped into kind of the difference between emotional rationality and sort of more rational instrumental thinking, and how the book could incorporate that. I think that's a question. I try not to rabble on, but I'm doing my best. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mark. I mean, I think that's you know, that's really opening up some really interesting areas, and the extent to which our current models of criminal justice are instrumentally rational in their approach, and I think to a large extent they are, you know, or at least they dress themselves up as being instrumentally rational, and that might be a way of avoiding something that they don't want to say that they are, but that they in fact are. So I'm thinking about, let's say, deterrence theory, or an incapacitation theory, which in both cases would say, well, look, we're simply in the business of means end calculations. You know, what would deter this person? Or, you know, what would protect society? What kind of sentences do we need to do to protect society? But often underlying that instrumental, that sort of seeming instrumental rationality, there's something else going on, and is quite often you see that, for example, the idea of incapacitation is quite strongly linked with an idea of they deserve it. They deserve this long sentence. And so is this, they deserve this long sentence, an entirely separate thing from the question of the instrumental rationality, or is the instrumental rationality sort of covering up for the sense of an anger-based desert approach? So I think instrumental rationality, I think there's something going on behind instrumental rationality a lot of the time, and I suppose that Bauman would be saying exactly the same thing, actually, you know, that that to think that we can act in an instrumentally rational way is a way of absolving ourselves from a certain moral responsibility to think in a deeper way about the things that we're doing. And, you know, you can go back to Eichmann in Jerusalem and etc. to sort of see those things playing out. So emotional rationality, I think, is the way to go. And I think that emotional rationality then has to be separated out into the different forms that it can take. So emotional rationality could be, I want you to be punished because I'm angry with you. That's an emotional rationality, you know. But it's an emotional rationality of a particular kind. And what I would say is that, you know, if you think about the process of reacting to something that happens to you, just take an everyday example. You know, someone you're walking along the road, you're walking along a path through the park, and from behind you someone comes along and vigorously bumps into you, and then heads off past you without saying anything. What's your first reaction? Your first reaction is one of anger, you know, because you're shocked. Your defense mechanisms are invoked. Your sense of the rudeness of what's happened. These are all things, and you think, you know, if you could get a hold of that person, than you'd like to. So there's that whole side of things. But then you carry on walking a bit further. You talk to the person you're with. You share your experience with someone else. You think about the reasons why that person might have done the things that they did. You think about what kind of person that might have been, and how they got to be that kind of person. And that's an emotional way of thinking rationally that is, I think, more grounded in a deeper understanding of our universality, how we are the same as each other, and it's not based on a sense of the doer and the done to. These other people, they're different from us. I think as we relate experience, so that sense of being a victim is a sense of thinking about the oneness, our oneness, rather than wanting that person to be hurt. And so that's another kind of emotional rationality. And that kind of emotional rationality is, I think, the one that we are capable of if we allow ourselves to be. So that's the one that I would go with. And that is, so yeah, and social distance is caught up in both these things, in both kinds of emotional rationality. So we see the person who looks different from us, the person who looks like, I don't want to enter into caricatures, but the person who just looks like someone who ought to be, dealt with as the other, however we might construct the other. And of course, that is it. And then we say, well, that's because that person is other to us. We can have no real regret about them being punished. In fact, they deserve it because they deserve it for their otherness, not for their act, but for their otherness. That all trades off social distance. Once you meet the so-called other, and that's where the restorative conference comes in, then the social distance does get removed for the time of that, but also in a way going forward, because once you've rethought the thing, it's harder to go back to the initial sense of social distance. So yeah, emotional rationality in its different forms is, I think, very clearly linked to social distance.
Yeah, thank you. And I was thinking of Howard Zinn when he talks about, and what I witnessed many a time with victims, when you suffer a violation of the self, and you ask the why me question: why did you burgle my house? Why did you bump me to the road? And that kind of feels like it destabilizes a sense of ontological control over our life, and it's that kind of continuum we expect to have this kind of control, which actually in a chaotic open system is just not there.
Yeah, it's not there, Mark, a lot of the time, and yet it's something that I think we do strive for.
Yeah.
And we are very fortunate if we're able to live lives where we're able to say that we want to make sense of our lives as a whole, and to understand and to integrate what happened into us, so that going forward we see, however difficult an experience might have been, that we have got a sense of our ontological completeness. And of course that's a kind of life's work, because as we get older, different things come to challenge it and so on. But I think we're always working with that sense of a self, and trying to make sense of being a self, even if we know that we're pulled in very different directions. And Hans Lowald talks about the superego as what he calls an atonement structure, and by that he means it's the structure in the mind, in the mind/body, integrating thought and feeling, that is trying to always find a way back to oneness, even as it deals with all sorts of things that threaten to pull it apart. So an atonement structure is actually an at-one-ment structure. in Loval's account.
Yeah, thank you, Alan.
Thanks both. No desire to dominate the discussion, although I've got plenty more questions. But would anybody else like to put a question to Alan?
If I may ask a question.
Thanks, Carla. Please do.
So thank you very much, first of all, Alan, for the paper and the presentation. I wanted to just ask you one question, and I wonder if you could perhaps explain a little bit more the connection between the construct that you've used, the metaphysical animal, and the idea that retribution shouldn't actually mean punishment, particularly the metaphysical part. And I ask because I was actually thinking, obviously, animals, as in chicken and pigs and cows, we know that they cannot think, ethically in the same way that humans do. Okay, so they would know Kant and so on. But at the same time, I don't think that we can say definitively that they have no ethical thinking at all on their own terms. And I was therefore wondering, because there are also other human beings who we know that they also think in ethical terms that are totally different from us. Think Adolf Hitler or many politicians nowadays. And I just therefore wonder, what is the connection between this kind of construct, that humans are metaphysical animals, and this central idea or argument that you're making, which I find very compelling, and I'm very interested to read about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalok. First of all, I agree with you that animals, and the more developed animals are, the more I think they do have ethical forms of being, and plainly these in some ways significantly overlap with human ethical being, and in some ways human ethical being is different from them. And I sometimes think about the way in which, anyone who's had I'll put cats on one side, not sure about them, but anyone who's had a dog as a pet knows that there is in the canine ethical in canine ethical being the possibility of the snarl and the attack that is based upon an angry reaction, and at the same time there is the possibility of a kind of quite an extreme insistence upon the role of the pack, the community, the canine community, and the dog's place, the individual dog's place within the community. And now I don't want to, so that's just to agree with you on that. And I don't want to then say, oh, well, it's exactly the same. But I think there is a parallel in how we think about humans. So I think in the example, the illustration I gave to Mark of that sense of the initial angry reaction, and then the retrenchment to a broader and deeper and a more developed reaction, a more mature reaction. And I think that's the way in which we work as metaphysical animals. And I think what I found really interesting in working through the central section of the book was the ability to see that if one looked closely at Freud, and equally if one looked closely at Melanie Klein, you could see that both of those great analysts in the psychoanalytical tradition, they both have those two, they both describe those two different kinds of approaches. The one that's based on anger and the one that's based on a deeper understanding of love. So in Freud, it's the idea of the angry father who is brought within the human mind, within the child's mind, and and becomes representative of becomes a representative of fear and anger within the individual, and the effects that that has. But then alongside that, and this is I think this is certainly the Freud's more developed position, but he didn't develop it fully, but it is the developed position that comes out of his understanding of ego and superego formation. And that is the Freud that Löwald and Jonathan Lear in particular emphasize. It's the Freud that sees ego and superego formation as being an information of love, an information of the life drive. So, I hope that's getting round to being an answer to your question. That I could talk about Melanie Klein as well in similar terms. That the metaphysical animal is this complex animal that with different developmental possibilities in place, and one that copes better with its life, I think, to the extent that it operates with a mature conception rather than a more early or more primitive understanding of how it should work. The problem that we have is that if you look at politicians, then politicians seem to hone in on the punitive reaction much more readily than the mature reaction. Why is that? Well, I think it's because the mature reaction is the one that carries carries favor with an immediate and not thought through anger, and so politicians can use that to produce kind of populist reactions, law and order type politics, and that at the political level, that's part of the problem that we face.
Thanks, Carl. Just well, perhaps other people are gathering their thoughts again. A note from Fidelis in the chat. Good question from Carlock. Take into account Kahneman, rational and irrational aspects of human thinking. The example of politicians have even gone far. What about mental health or even disability? Animals do have conscious thinking as well. Maybe humans couldn't make sense of animals. Okay, so just some thoughts in the chat from Fidelis. Any other questions before I jump in with another one from anybody?
Adam, we do have one in the chat. We do so. Professor Alex Stevens from Sheffield sadly couldn't make tonight, but he's so interested in Alan's talk, he wanted to ask a question. So I read it out. Is there a psychological similarity between the desire for abolition of prisons or the police and the urge to punish people for behaviours that are considered immoral, e.g. punitive drug prohibition? Both seem rooted in a desire to achieve moral absolutes and the complete elimination of unwanted behaviours.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, I puzzled over that question. You sent it to me earlier on, and I puzzled over it because I couldn't quite see how the two were being brought together. For a start, this is not an account of punishment. that I'm giving in anything like the sense. It's an account of, as I've said, reconciliation. It's an account of how you get people to come through the desire for punishment rather than wanting to punish anyone. So I couldn't quite see how this was being put together, and I wondered if there was, as it were, a question behind the question, which was the thing about moral absolutes, and whether my position was morally absolute, which I don't think it is. I don't think it's morally absolutist to make naturalistic statements about the nature of human being. I could be wrong about what I've said there. You know, as a good critical realist, my position is that you know, that the best theory is the one that explains more of the phenomena. And so what I'm saying about the nature of the human animal could be wrong. And if it is, then it's defeasible on that basis. So I'm not making an absolute claim. I'm making a claim about the nature of human being, but I'm happy to be told that that's incorrect. So yeah, I don't think it is absolutist, and I'm certainly not in favor of punishing drug takers.
What would you make of the? I was thinking of Archer's internal conversation, and she gives the individuals have various different types of internal conversation. I mean, going to sort of what Carla was saying, really, is there a critique for restorative justice that I've done? There is an assumption of free will there, isn't there? But also, leaning into Archer's internal conversation, people have different capacities potentially. Even going into Fidelity's question there, are you nuancing for that, or where would you be on that kind of causation argument of somebody causing harm?
So how do you link the causation argument up with Maggie Archer's work?
Well, if people have different internal conversations, potentially that gives the potentiality for different abilities and capacities. I'm thinking a bit like, for instance, Sam Harris's work when he talks about criminal behavior and gives a kind of scale in that book about the same crime, where he then breaks down a different, a general denigration of a lack of capacity of the human being, where actually the law just takes the act, the criminal act as you've done this on that day, and apart from a few mitigating factors, really going back to classical criminology, leans on free will and agency.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas actually science is really at least leaning towards a sort of soft determinism. Sorry, I didn't put that question in there. Sorry.
Yeah, I get it now. And I think there's 2 points to make. One about Maggie's internal conversation is that I think that idea of the internal conversation is a really important one. What I would want to do is to extend it further than Maggie went, in that, in my understanding of what she was saying, the internal conversation sort of stayed at the level of conversations, and didn't go deeply into the kind of the psychoanalytic roots of conversations. So, I mean, it seems to me that it's really quite important for us to be able to understand something like the unconscious. And my recollection is that Maggie was not a fan of Freud or the unconscious. But it seems to me it's really important that we understand, so if you take, for example, a man who beats his partner, and does it persistently, does it repetitively, then it seems to me that then what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to understand not just the we need to deepen that internal conversation that man is having with himself. It won't help us to know that man's internal conversation is one that leads to him beating his partner. What we need to know is how that conversation might be deepened so that we understand why he beats his partner, and how he might understand that that is not the way in which he should think about things. So he should change his internal conversation. And part of changing his internal conversation is likely to be addressing some of the reasons that are not really conscious to him, not immediately conscious to him, as to why he behaves in that way. Why does he get so angry and resentful? Why can't he take a conversation at the level at which, why can't he take a criticism, and so on and so forth? And, you know, we know that people who do that sort of thing are often quite damaged, and we need to bring out what it is, where the damage comes from, and how to get that person through conversations to think, to understand and recognize that that's not the way that they want to deal with things going forward. And that picks up the free will issue, because I think what we need to get away from is a simplistic conception of free will, in which free will becomes the other of determinism. And what we need to understand is the way in which freedom is something that develops for us in the ways that we relate to the world, and linked to that is a sense not of being held responsible and punished for things, but a sense that we should take responsibility for the things that we've done. Yeah. And if we take responsibility for the things we've done, then we are acting freely. That is a substantive conception of what it means to act freely. We need to be able to take responsibility, which then takes you back to the relationship between the internal conversation as a surface thing and the deeper lying issues in the unconscious that need to be explored. So freedom for the partner beater, real freedom for the partner beater is understanding why they do it and why they don't have to do it anymore.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks. Sakia, did you want to say something? Please come in.
I'd like to jump in there. Thank you so much, Alan. It was a really talk, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. And I'm so glad that you talked about, you know, domestic abuse there, because that's what my research is on. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I don't know what your reflections are on this, but I was thinking about social distance. And if you look at, if you're coming now from the battered partner's point of view, they would, so they're notorious for not maybe pressing charges or not probably recognizing abuse as abuse. And I would argue that probably this results from reducing that social distance, because they're right in the middle of it, and looking at the two reactions that you talked about. So you can have a reaction based on anger about what has happened, or one, or that comes from a deeper understanding of love, which you describe as the more mature attitude. However, this, if I'm right in characterizing the battered partner's reaction in this way, this is frowned upon in society as allowing the abuse to go on. So I don't know whether you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Sakia. It allows me to sort of develop my point a little bit, because I think what I would like to, what I do say is that that in between anger and love, or abutting love, there is a kind of righteous anger. So you can have a kind of as human beings, things flow into each other. You know, we don't have one compartment in our head, in our brain, which is sort of primitive anger, and another compartment in our brain which is mature love. What we have is what we are is an organism, if you like, an organism that is capable of reacting quickly and angrily, and an organism that is capable of acting according to what we think is right and wrong, and that acting according to what we think is right and wrong is part of, I think, you know, a deeper moral understanding of how we should behave with each other. So now, if people don't do that, if people don't behave in the way that we think they should to us, then you can be angry in two different ways. So first of all, you can be just angry, just plain angry, you know, and want to react straight away. But you can also be sort of morally outraged and angry in that sense. So that's two different kinds of anger. One is a reactive anger, hitting back, I want to hit back. The other is a kind of morally outraged anger, which is that was wrong what that person did. And in standing up for myself, I want to call that person to account. And that's a form of self-love, you know, to do that.
Can I follow on from that?
Please do. Yeah.
Where you have a situation where it doesn't appear that someone is exercising that self-love and actually looks like quite the opposite. I just wonder where you think we sort of have the right to sort of legislate over that or pass judgments over that. I don't know whether this sits with whether well, I don't know whether I've got this right, or I don't know if you understand my question. Is like,
yeah.
Morally outraged, then there's place for that. But where they're not morally outraged, where does that sit in the whole consideration?
Yeah. So you're talking about the person who's being victimized, and violated. Yeah. I mean, I think that's. I think there's a number of different aspects to responding to that question. I mean, obviously there are going to be, especially in today's world where we know that violence of men towards women is in some way linked to hegemonic ideas. We know that these things go on, and so in the actually existing world, we need to think about how to intervene and protect, and that's a question that doesn't get lost, even if it's not the direct basis for the argument that I'm making. That's a question about the relationship between the real and the actual, and needs to be thought of needs to be acknowledged and worked through. But the other thing I think that's really important there is to think about what would be the ways in which a person who just takes it could be supported to not be like that. You know, what would be the ways in which we could, through friends, through family, through work contacts, through academic understanding, through social processes, what would be the ways in which we would support a person who doesn't know how to respond to violation? And I think a really important element for that person is for them to understand why it's not okay for that to be happening to them. And that's really about developing their sense of themselves, their sense of who they are, their sense of their oneness and their importance, and therefore their sense of the love that they are entitled to have from others and entitled to demand from others in the way that they're treated. So the idea of self-development, sort of the atonement, the superego as an atonement structure is, I think, about the way in which we support people to be able to think better of themselves in that kind of situation.
Thanks, both. We have a question from Craig, who wants to follow on directly from that. Up to you, Craig.
Oh yeah, thanks. Actually, my question was sort of following a person that had a question read out.
Oh, Fidelis, yes. About do we have a moral organism? Yeah.
No.
Sorry.
Alex Stevens, was it?
Yeah, it might have been that one. Yeah, about the sort of equivalence of what you're doing with what you're criticizing. That was the sort of idea, wasn't it? I mean, just a couple of thoughts on it, because I mean that I think that's a kind of that's probably a kind of objection that you'll encounter. It's kind of reviving an old argument against psychoanalysis that goes back to things like the authoritarian personality. That was a line of critique against that you're pathologizing the things you don't like, but surely to be consistent there should be a psychoanalytic explanation for your not liking those things just as much as there is for so there should be just as much a psychoanalytic explanation for you not liking punishment as there is for retributivists like not liking criminals or something, and that sort of equivalence argument. I mean, the first thought that there's an obvious distinction, which is that the retributivist wants to impose their dislike for something by coercion, and the critic of punishment doesn't want to arrest retributivists and put them in prison. You're trying to persuade people rather than coerce them. But it also occurred to me that there might be a deeper way of sort of putting the point in the sort of terms of Kleinian moral psychology, which would be something like that just as the retributivist is, or the retributive kind of conception is somehow caught in a position of splitting that's not is not able to integrate the ambivalence of human nature, and that's trying to deny the bad stuff, then isn't the abolitionist also in the same position of trying to deny the bad stuff? So from you might sort of put the point in a Nietzschean, Freudian kind of way that, well, human nature does have this aggressive, hostile impulses in it as well, and isn't punishment actually quite a good compromise? Right? Retributive punishment, the justice model, isn't that quite a good compromise way of dealing with these aggressive impulses? And aren't the animal that thinks and loves, isn't it the animal that thinks and loves and hates?
Mm-hmm.
It's just not really. Yeah, I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but yeah.
Yeah. Nice one. Yeah. So I think the key for me, well, one way of answering that would be let's take Klein. She talks about that we grow up from our infantile beginnings. We grow up with a persecutory desire And alongside that persecutory desire, we have the possibility of what she calls the depressive position, which is not a great name for it, maybe, but the depressive position is one that realizes that we're not all good or all bad, and that we may have damaged the people. You know, we may have damaged our mothers in fantasy. We may have damaged our mothers by hating them so much, and when they didn't look after us properly. You probably resist that as as an encounter of Klein, but go with it for the moment. So there's those two positions. There's the persecutory, or the paranoid schizoid position, and the depressive position. And the one follows on from the other and is a consequence of the other. So I suppose my response would be to say that these are not equivalents in Klein. They're developmental positions, and you can regress back into the paranoid schizoid position, or you can progress out of it into the depressive position. And it's better to be in the depressive position. It's better for your health and your well-being to be in the depressive position rather than the paranoid schizoid position. So I don't think it, so. Yeah, so taking that into thinking about the animal that thinks and loves and hates, the hate is something that the loving animal is trying to get beyond, trying to contain, rather than that these are equal positions, and we got both going on. Therefore, we need to respond to both equally. I think that's the way I'd respond to it. I could maybe make an argument about Freud in a similar way, but I'm not sure. I need to think that through a bit more.
Okay, everyone. Since we're coming towards somewhat of a conclusion, although we've still got some minutes left, if there were any further queries that people wanted to put to Alan, but he stayed with us, grilled a fair bit this evening. I mean, I would just by way, perhaps, of bringing something to a conclusion. I accept that the book, as you've described it, Alan, is not an exercise in concrete analysis, or as you put at the outset, of applied critical realism. But I wonder if the next book, if you like, or the next stage of your thinking, or where this goes, is to address more centrally the practical adequacy of your thesis and where this might go, and perhaps developing a little bit of the points that Craig was introducing there, some which occurred to me, you know, the sort of Nietzschean, the thanatological as opposed to erotic concept of human being, if we want to go back to some of those ideas, the death drive rather than the life drive, and why one should prefer. I mean, I certainly prefer your account because I believe in life. And it's so much more, and not dying slowly, let alone quickly. And it seems to be more akin to the kind of the critical realist vision for an emancipated form of knowledge. And I don't see where there is the emancipation in pessimistic acknowledgement of tendencies towards death or resentment, or bitterness, vengeance, etc., which, of course, as one might imagine, are gaining some significant currency within criminological thought at the moment in these very pessimistic times, but which strike me as being quite teleological, reductive, you know, whereas what I like about your thesis being more akin to the critical realist mission of emancipatory knowledge is that there is the possibility to mature, as an individual, as a group, as a set of institutions, you know, but I think it seems to me that, you know, there's an argument. So well, when there is that standoff, and is that just a kind of an ethical warrant that one advances, or do we want to go even further and say, well, drawing upon critical realism, in actual fact, that we can best the Nietzscheans, you know, the Thanos, imperative and say, in actual fact, that's not humanity. Humanity, there is the internal necessary relationship of being a human being is to try to mature, is to want to live, and insofar as one abjures or denies that, one is ceasing to be human, or perhaps even a bit slowly rather than human, which I think is it's just with the deeper roots of that, and how one might then begin to connect that more profound ontological reflection on what it is to be living rather than dying, erotic rather than thanatological, one's outlook, to the practical adequacy questions. How does one begin to develop the institutions which then allow for a kind of flourishing rather than a slow death, as we've seen in the penological estate of the last 200 years in the West?
That's a very nice conclusion, Adam, and I agree with what you're, the way that you're looking at things. I mean, just one. I mean, of course, one of the things that got Freud going on the death drive was the experience of war, and of course, if we are experiencing, dreadful violence across the globe, and the outcomes that flow from that, then it's very tempting to take the kind of position that sort of says, well, that's clearly something that is a part of our human being, and maybe a dominant part of our human being, and of course, the more that happens, the harder it is perhaps to argue for something of a different kind that is based upon the idea of love. But at the same time, I think love, love is irreducible within us. It's there in the initial moments of life, the moment when we move from being one to being two, the parent and the child, and that initial moment that Freud talked about, that moment of the kind of the oceanic moment of a kind of an omnipotent love, so the primary narcissistic position. So I think that's in us, and happily, I don't think we can get rid of that. I don't think anyone can get rid of that. But we can certainly build worlds in ways that challenge that quite seriously, and I think we're well and truly embarked on doing that at the moment. But I think that part of my desire, part of my purpose in doing this book was to sort of say, well, look, there are plenty of people who can tell us how terrible the criminal justice system is, and I don't have any doubts about that. But what I know is that the more we sort of repeat that, the more we become part of it being terrible. In a way, you can say, well, being terrible, you can say that saying that something is terrible is criticizing it, but it's only criticizing it if you don't just end up repeating the trope that this thing is terrible. So you need some kind of position to be arguing from, to say, well, it is terrible, and it's terrible for these reasons. And I think so my aim in exploring love was to think through that kind of position, an ethically real position that could then be the basis for institutional criticisms. I think so. I'm definitely against the thanatological, although I think there are definitely things that go on in the world. I think with regards to Freud, the death drive versus the life drive, the thing about that is that, at least you can talk this through and work out whether what he meant by the death drive, but there is an argument for saying that he didn't have a very strong conception of how you would actually understand what the death drive was. He was actually much stronger in talking about love and the life drive, and the death drive was part of an earlier more rudimentary account of human psychology than came to pass with his work on the ego, the superego, and the id, and from that work onwards. So I think I'm prepared to. It might be an interesting place to take the argument, I think, and but I think also your point about the practical questions is really important, and you know, I'm not. One of the things that I've been working on with Amanda Wilson is an essay on, well, you know, what is it like to be actually engaged in the penal system, in the prison system, and how do people who are in that system, working in that system in one way or another, reconcile the fact that they think they're trying to do good things with some kind of overall sense that the system is terrible? Because there are lots of good people trying to do good things within a terrible system. And so we have to try and understand that. And I think we can only understand that if we understand the complexity of their position. And understanding that complexity means taking into account how an understanding of working restoratively and maturely in supporting people in these terrible places has a degree of possibility to it. You know, that's another paper that one could explore, and which obviously we don't have time for now. But I suppose I'm just trying to emphasize that being theoretical and being practical are I think two sides of the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fundamentally the case. Yes, but that's the position I wanted to hope that we'd come round to. I mean, I think it's been such an interesting, such a tremendously rich, thought-provoking evening, Alan. Thank you, and everyone for your contributions. It seems to me that part of practical adequacy in our fields, crime, security, and justice, what I find so striking, trying to be applied, talking to various practitioners within criminal justice and without, but interested in matters of security, is how often implicit rather than explicit and scrutinized their theories of change are. You know, about what they think they're doing and why it would have the outcomes that they wanted to have, even at that kind of level. And I think these kind of reflections, and we've been discussing this evening, are ways of grounding and fleshing out practical adequacy. It seems to me practical adequacy is fundamentally about theories of change. What does a probation officer think they're doing when they're working with a client of theirs such that they would, you know, desist from offending behaviour? Yeah, what are they, and how do we render those explicit, and how might we do that? So I think I totally agree, Alan. I mean, we, you know, from starting this evening saying, look, it's not about applied CR. These are fundamental, you know, a philosophical reflection. That's true, but I think always with critical realism, it leads us back to the concrete, back to the practically adequate. And I think these are many of the key concepts you've discussed. The mature retribution has very applied implications, you know, and that's what I'm trying to grapple with at the moment. Is the theories of change and how to think about that in a more realistic way. And your ideas we discussed this evening have been tremendously useful and informative of that. So thank you for my education.
Thank you for inviting me.